Loretta Williams had led a simple life, largely marked by routines and memories. After her husband, John, passed away in the winter of 2018, she settled into solitude in their modest, two-story home in rural Ohio. A well-loved figure in the small town, Loretta was known for her warm smile and generous spirit, yet beneath that exterior lay a profound loneliness. Her days were spent in silence, her nights echoing only with her own footsteps. Neighbors rarely saw her, and she rarely ventured beyond her property. Loretta's isolation was punctuated by only one regular joy: her twin grandchildren, Zachary and Logan Williams. At 22, the twins were close to Loretta, though each seemed to visit more out of duty than genuine affection. They shared little interest in her stories of the past, her quiet musings on life, or her subtle observations about the world they barely knew. Nevertheless, this summer they had decided to stay for a week at her place, a gesture she clung to with silent gratitude. Beth and Eric, the twins' parents, were scheduled to leave on a business trip. This time they entrusted the boys with their grandmother's care, a decision made more from convenience than necessity. They had intended it to be a quiet week where the boys could reconnect with their roots, while Beth and Eric managed work obligations in another state. Zach and Logan arrived with an air of youthful distraction, their hands gripping their phones and their eyes scanning screens, more often than meeting their grandmother's gaze. From the moment they entered, tension filled the air, an invisible current of subtle hostility between the twins and Loretta. Initially, it was subtle, almost ignorable. Loretta would reach out to touch Logan's arm, and he'd recoil, or she'd speak at length, only to find that neither grandson was listening. But as the days passed, Loretta began to feel an odd mix of longing and unease around the boys. There was an unspoken distance, an unfamiliarity in the way they spoke to her, a lack of recognition in their eyes when they looked at her. Still, she clung to the idea that this week could forge a bond between them. However, her own loneliness soon morphed into something more intense, a feeling she couldn't quite explain or control. She found herself gravitating toward them more frequently, trying harder to earn their attention, to break the indifference that radiated from them like an invisible barrier. For their part, Zach and Logan showed little interest in deepening the connection. They were polite but aloof, often retreating to their devices or simply ignoring her attempts to reminisce about the past. They spent most of their days in the house, avoiding the outside world and her presence, choosing instead to remain sequestered in their rooms, leaving Loretta in silence once more. By the third day, a thick silence had settled over the house. Loretta had grown increasingly agitated, and an uneasy dynamic began to form. Her attempts to engage her grandsons had gone beyond simple pleas for attention. They bordered on an almost desperate fixation. She began hovering, asking probing questions about their lives, their plans, their thoughts. The twins, increasingly unnerved by her intense focus, retreated further, locking doors and creating their own private sanctuary within her home. But Loretta was persistent, her solitude, compounded by the excitement of her grandson's presence, had grown into something more insistent. She began showing up outside their doors at odd hours, bringing tea and snacks unprompted, hoping to catch a moment of closeness with them. She shared stories that grew increasingly personal, details about her late husband and her disappointments in life, things she'd never shared with anyone before. The twins were polite but visibly uncomfortable, listening only out of obligation rather than genuine interest. An unsettling energy began to fill the house. Loretta, once been a stable, predictable presence, was behaving in ways the twins found strange and intrusive. They began avoiding her altogether, and an unspoken agreement formed between them to minimize their time spent in her company. They had no way of understanding the depth of her loneliness, nor the complicated emotions she wrestled with as she watched them slip further away. As the days dragged on, the tension built quietly but palpably, lurking under the surface. Loretta's loneliness now bordered on obsession, and her actions grew more peculiar. She would leave little notes under their doors, handwritten messages filled with words of affection that felt misplaced and unsettling. She spoke of how her life felt empty and how much she needed them there. Words that made the twins exchange wary glances, uneasy about her increasingly desperate tone. Then came the night of the incident, the event that would alter the Williams family's course irrevocably. The evening began like any other. Loretta moved through her dimly lit house, her steps slow and deliberate, the sound of her shuffling slippers barely audible. Outside, a storm gathered, thunder rumbling in the distance as rain pelted against the windows. Inside, the air felt thick and heavy, mirroring the rising tension between her and her grandsons. Zach and Logan were locked away in their shared room, the faint glow of their phones casting shadows on the walls as they whispered to each other, likely strategizing on how to manage the rest of their stay. Just as Loretta was preparing tea, another one of her peace offerings to them, a set of headlights flashed through the rain-drenched window. The sudden light caught her off guard, and she squinted through the downpour to see a car pull into her driveway. A sense of foreboding gripped her as she recognized the vehicle. Beth and Eric were home early. The twins were equally shocked to see their parents at the door, their expressions a mixture of relief and guilt. Loretta stood in the kitchen, hands trembling as she set the tea tray down, feeling a wave of anxiety she couldn't quite place. Beth stepped inside first, rain dripping from her coat, eyes scanning the room with a sharp, discerning gaze that immediately fell upon her mother. The strained atmosphere was immediately apparent. Beth's unease deepened as she observed her mother's expression, one that carried an intensity she hadn't seen before. Loretta, sensing her daughter's scrutiny, tried to brush it off with a nervous smile, but it did little to mask the undercurrent of tension running through the house. Beth, perceptive and quick to notice details, felt a rising discomfort as she sensed that something was amiss. With little preamble, Beth pulled her sons aside, her voice barely above a whisper, as she questioned them about the past few days. The twins hesitated, exchanging glances as they struggled to put their complicated feelings into words. Their descriptions were vague, tinged with a sense of unease that only deepened Beth's suspicions. Her eyes darted back to Loretta, who hovered at the edge of the kitchen, hands nervously clasped as she awaited some form of acknowledgement, something to ease the growing tension. When Beth finally approached her mother, the conversation quickly devolved. Beth questioned her about the twins' stories, pressing her to explain the odd behavior they'd described. But Loretta was defensive, her responses shifting between guilt and indignation. Her loneliness had driven her to strange, perhaps even inappropriate, actions, but she couldn't seem to articulate or justify them. Beth's tone grew sharper, her words cutting as she demanded answers, her frustrations building with every evasive response Loretta offered. It was clear that the bond between mother and daughter had worn thin over the years, frayed by misunderstandings and unspoken resentments that had festered long before this night. Now those emotions erupted in full force, neither one holding back, each word leaving a deeper wound. The argument escalated quickly, the storm outside matching the intensity of their raised voices. Beth's anger turned into a desperate frustration, her words slipping into accusations as she tried to make sense of the unsettling details she was uncovering. Loretta, backed into a corner, finally snapped under the pressure, her defenses crumbling as her loneliness and despair surfaced in a torrent of confessions and rationalizations. She spoke of the emptiness that had consumed her since her husband's death, of how her grandson's presence had ignited something she hadn't felt in years, a desire for connection, for meaning. Beth recoiled, horrified by what she was hearing, the implications of Loretta's words twisting into something darker and more disturbing than she had anticipated. The weight of Loretta's confession was overwhelming, leaving Beth speechless, her mind reeling with a mix of shock and disgust. Eric, standing nearby, tried to intervene, his voice a calm but strained attempt to de-escalate the situation. But Loretta, already emotionally raw and defensive, interpreted his words as another rejection, another reminder of her isolation. As Beth's accusations grew sharper, Loretta turned to escape, her vision blurred with tears, her heart pounding in a frenzy of panic and shame. In her haste, Loretta stumbled near the staircase, her hand reaching out for the railing that was just beyond her grasp. Her foot slipped on the edge of the top step, and in an instant, she was falling, her body twisting as she tumbled down the narrow staircase. The moment seemed to stretch endlessly, her frail form hitting each step with a sickening thud that echoed through the house. When she reached the bottom, there was silence, broken only by the muffled sounds of the storm outside. Beth and Eric rushed down, their faces pale, their eyes wide with shock as they took in the sight of Loretta's crumpled form sprawled at the base of the stairs. Blood pooled beneath her, her eyes fixed open in a vacant stare that spoke of a life extinguished in an instant. Beth staggered back, hands covering her mouth as she tried to process the horror of what had just happened. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, an unbearable burden of guilt and grief, mingled with a lingering sense of betrayal that she couldn't fully shake. The ambulance arrived within minutes, sirens slicing through the oppressive silence that had settled over the house. The paramedics moved quickly, their faces grim as they confirmed what Beth and Eric already knew. Loretta Williams was gone. Outside, police cars pulled into the driveway, red and blue lights casting a stark, unforgiving glow across the rain-soaked yard. Detectives interviewed each family member, piecing together the chaotic fragments of the evening's events. Beth could barely speak, her responses reduced to halting phrases, each word weighed down by shock. Eric, still reeling, managed to explain that Loretta had fallen during an argument. Meanwhile, Zach and Logan, pale and silent, hovered in the background, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. They hadn't witnessed the fall, but the palpable tension that lingered in the air made it clear that something irreversible had occurred between their mother and grandmother. After examining the scene, the police concluded that it was an accident. Loretta had slipped in her panic, a tragic end to an already fractured evening. There was no foul play, no evidence to suggest otherwise, and with that, the case was closed. But for the Williams family, the ordeal was far from over. The circumstances of Loretta's death lingered like a specter, haunting the household and fueling questions that would remain forever unanswered. Beth couldn't escape the crushing guilt that followed her day after day. She replayed the argument in her mind, her harsh words echoing back to her like accusations, each one a reminder of the anger and pain she had unleashed in those final moments. She found herself staring at the staircase where Loretta had fallen, wondering if a softer tone, a gentler approach, might have prevented the tragedy. But the past was an unyielding wall, and no amount of regret could change what had happened. For the twins, the trauma of that night manifested in ways they struggled to articulate. They had seen their grandmother as an odd, lonely woman, yet her sudden death left a void that was unexpectedly painful. The strange connection Loretta had tried to forge with them now lingered in their minds, a haunting reminder of how little they'd truly understood her. Each struggled to reconcile the unsettling memories of those final days with the guilt that gnawed at them, an unshakable feeling that they had, in some way, contributed to their grandmother's spiral. Beth's life began to fall apart in the weeks that followed. Sleepless nights bled into anxious days as she grappled with her conflicting emotions. Her relationship with Eric strained under the weight of her guilt and grief, the two of them barely speaking except in terse exchanges or whispers late at night. The loss of her mother reopened old wounds, memories of a childhood marked by Loretta's emotional distance and erratic behavior. Loretta had always been a difficult presence, a woman who rarely showed warmth or affection, but her death now painted those memories in a harsher light. Unable to bear the silence of the house, Beth threw herself into her work, using the demands of her job as a distraction. But even there, the memories crept in, her mind wandering back to the final moments on the stairs, the sound of her mother's body hitting each step a relentless echo she couldn't shake. Co-workers noticed her distracted state, the way her hands shook when she thought no one was looking, the dark circles under her eyes. She withdrew from friends, avoided social gatherings, and spent more time locked away in her office or the quiet sanctuary of her bedroom. Eric, concerned yet equally haunted, tried to reach her, but Beth's grief had twisted into a private torment that left little room for comfort. She began lashing out, accusing him of not understanding, of failing to see how much her mother's death had affected her. The once solid foundation of their marriage began to crumble, each argument widening the growing chasm between them. To complicate matters further, Beth's relationship with her sons took a dark turn. Zach and Logan, struggling with their own guilt and confusion, felt the sting of their mother's mistrust. Beth's gaze lingered too long on them, her expression a mixture of wariness and hurt that made them feel like strangers in their own home. Her questions, at first gentle, soon grew probing, her words tinged with accusations she didn't dare voice aloud. It was as if she suspected them of something unspoken, some hidden culpability in Loretta's death that she couldn't quite articulate. The twins, feeling the weight of their mother's suspicion, began to withdraw further. They spent more time away from the house, lingering at friends' homes or finding excuses to avoid family dinners. The once close bond they had with their mother felt fractured beyond repair, each of them retreating into their own private turmoil, unable to bridge the widening gap. Beth, alone in her suffering, found herself drawn back to her mother's empty home. She visited often, wandering through the rooms where Loretta had once lived, searching for answers in the stillness of the abandoned house. She rifled through her mother's belongings, hoping to find something that would shed light on Loretta's final days, a letter, a diary, anything that might explain the desperation she had sensed in her mother's actions. But the house yielded no answers, only more questions, each one a reminder of the mysteries Loretta had taken to her grave. During one of her visits to Loretta's house, Beth stumbled upon a locked drawer in her mother's bedroom dresser. Intrigued and desperate for some kind of explanation, she searched for the key, combing through drawers and boxes in the closet, until she finally found it hidden in an old jewelry box. With trembling hands, she unlocked the drawer and pulled it open, revealing a collection of papers, letters, and faded photographs. Among the papers, Beth found a series of handwritten letters addressed to no one in particular, letters that read more like journal entries than correspondence. The entries spanned years, each one detailing fragments of Loretta's life that Beth had never known about: her deep loneliness after her husband's death, her feelings of abandonment as her family grew distant, and, disturbingly, her obsessive longing for connection with her grandchildren. Loretta's words were a mix of longing, bitterness, and confusion, as if she had been grappling with emotions she couldn't understand, feelings that grew more intense and irrational over time. One entry, dated just a few weeks before her death, struck Beth the hardest. In it, Loretta wrote about her desire to keep Zach and Logan close to her, her fear that they would leave her like everyone else had. She described in vivid detail her disappointment and hurt when they withdrew from her, and the strange sense of betrayal she felt by their aloofness. The language was raw, almost desperate, hinting at a need for control over her grandchildren's lives that went beyond what Beth considered normal or healthy. Beth sat in stunned silence, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what she was reading. The letters painted a portrait of a woman unraveling, a woman who had become consumed by her own loneliness and emotional needs. Loretta's obsession with Zach and Logan had been more intense, more troubling than Beth had realized, a fixation that left her feeling unsettled and disturbed. As she sifted through the letters, Beth found a photograph tucked between two pages, its edges worn and faded. The image showed Loretta with Zach and Logan, taken just a few years earlier. Loretta's smile was wide, almost manic, her arm wrapped tightly around each grandson, as if afraid they might disappear. The twins looked uncomfortable, their smiles forced, their bodies leaning slightly away from their grandmother's embrace. The picture now seemed to capture something Beth hadn't noticed before: attention, a discomfort that hinted at the strange dynamic she had only recently come to understand. The realization struck her hard. Her mother's relationship with her grandsons had been far more complicated than she had ever imagined. Loretta's isolation had morphed into an unhealthy obsession, one that had driven her to cross boundaries in ways Beth couldn't fully comprehend. Beth felt a mixture of revulsion and pity, torn between sympathy for her mother's loneliness and horror at the lengths she had gone to keep her family close. These discoveries left Beth reeling, her mind consumed by the thought that she had never really known her mother, the woman who had raised her, who had shaped her life in ways both good and bad, was a stranger, someone with hidden depths that Beth had only now begun to see. Beth's discoveries changed everything. She couldn't look at Zach and Logan without feeling a pang of guilt and unease, a gnawing suspicion that perhaps they had sensed Loretta's intentions, that they had felt her strange fixation and kept it hidden from her. She began questioning them again, her voice wavering between motherly concern and barely veiled accusation, trying to draw out any details they might have kept from her. But the twins, weary and guarded, offered little, their responses evasive and clipped, their faces closed off. Beth's relentless questioning only drove a deeper wedge between them, her sons retreating further into themselves, their silence speaking volumes. The trust they once shared was shattered, replaced by a palpable tension that infected every interaction. Eric, increasingly worried about his wife's mental state, tried to intervene, pleading with her to leave the past behind, to let go of the endless questions that were tearing their family apart. But Beth couldn't stop. She felt trapped in a cycle of doubt and suspicion, her mother's letters replaying in her mind like a haunting refrain. As weeks turned into months, Beth's obsession began to consume her. She quit her job, finding herself unable to focus on anything outside of the unraveling mystery of her mother's final days. She returned to Loretta's house almost daily, poring over every item, every scrap of paper, hoping to find some final clue that would explain everything, that would bring her peace. But the house held only silence, its walls a testament to her mother's loneliness and her own growing isolation. The toll on her family was undeniable. Eric, struggling to hold their marriage together, began spending more time away from home, retreating into work and finding excuses to avoid the fraught atmosphere that had come to define their household. The twins, left to navigate their own trauma, grew resentful of their mother's obsession, resenting the unspoken accusations and the way she seemed to see them as strangers, almost enemies. Then, one evening, Beth made a final discovery, one that would push her to the brink. Hidden beneath the floorboards in Loretta's bedroom, she found a small wooden box, inside of which was a family heirloom, her father's watch. Attached to it was a letter from Loretta, written in her shaky handwriting, addressed to Beth. In the letter, Loretta confessed her guilt, not about her relationship with Zach and Logan, but about her failings as a mother. She acknowledged the emotional distance that had always existed between her and Beth, the way she had struggled to connect with her, to show the love that she had always felt but rarely expressed. Loretta wrote of her loneliness, of her desperation for connection, and of how she had tried to find in her grandsons what she had failed to create with her daughter. The letter was both a confession and an apology, a final attempt to bridge the divide that had defined their relationship. As Beth read her mother's words, the weight of her grief and anger came crashing down on her, leaving her drained, her heart heavy with regret. The realization that her mother had understood her own flaws, had recognized her mistakes, brought a bittersweet sense of closure, but it was a closure that came too late. Beth returned home that night, clutching the letter, her mind a blur of emotions she couldn't begin to process. The family she had once known was gone, fractured beyond repair by the ghosts of the past, by secrets and misunderstandings that had festered for years. And as she looked around at the faces of her husband and sons, Beth realized that the damage was done, that the family she had once held so dearly was now just a collection of strangers, bound together only by the scars Loretta had left behind. Beth spent the days that followed in a state of fragile numbness, carrying the weight of her mother's final words like a heavy stone. She found herself drifting through the routines of her life, but everything felt hollow.